I'm so excited that you took the time to join us on the next episode of Beyond the Culture. This is the show where we embrace change and challenge cultural norms and ideals. I'm your host, Dr. David Walker. Dr. Culp, how are you today?
Dr. Walker, I'm doing tremendous. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, and I'm so excited about having you on the show today. But let me give you your official introduction. My guest today is Dr. Brian Culp. Dr. Culp is the Assistant Chair of the Department of Health Promotion and Physical Education and Professor of Health and Physical Education at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia. Dr. Culp's current research interests are biopolitics, leadership, archetypes, community physical activity, kinesiology, and a subject that we're going to talk about today, spatial injustice. Dr. Culp has written and published many peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. He has received several significant awards and distinctions. And I am super excited to have on the show, Beyond the Culture, my guest today, Dr. Brian Culp. Dr. Culp, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today, primarily because of the current climate that we are living in. And as you know, and many of my listeners know, we're in the middle of the George Floyd trial over in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And everybody knows that's the trial where the police officer was videotaped with his knee on the neck of George Floyd for well over 9 minutes. And ultimately, he has died. And that trial is going on right now. And then, of course, being from Georgia, you guys in Georgia are dealing with voter registration restrictions or voter suppression. So that's a current issue, a current social justice issue, an issue that obviously has impacted and affected Black people tremendously. So I want to talk about that because you have a background in social justice, a background in race-related issues. So I want to start here. What spurred you to get involved with race issues and social justice matters? Just take us into that background of how that started for you.
That is a great question. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of kind of how I got to this point, obviously. So I grew up in Southwest DeKalb County in Atlanta, Georgia. Born in 1976, so I was a bicentennial baby.
All right.
Outside of Atlanta, for people who are longtime Atlanta individuals, people who live there. And I have to preface that because of Atlanta's growing to a point that is getting so big now that to meet someone who's actually from Atlanta or an Atlanta area is rare when I walk and talk to people. So I grew up a little bit outside of Atlanta, a little bit outside of Decatur, and in an all Black neighborhood. In our neighborhoods, one of the things that I noticed growing up as a latchkey kid and walking around to these neighborhoods was the fact that our resources there were not necessarily as good as some of the places that we would go visit, either into North Atlanta or even where I work at right now, Cobb County. I spent a lot of time growing up doing a lot of youth-related sports. My parents were involved in church. We were involved like in Boy Scouts and things such as that. So we would travel a lot like outside the community to actually participate in these activities. So after staying in school for a while, obviously going to elementary school, Flat Hills Elementary School, and then going to Tucker High School in Decatur, Atlanta, Decatur, sort of what they would call the Atlanta area. Now, I ended up going to the University of Georgia to get like a degree. At the time, I thought it was going to be landscape architecture. Okay. And my dad was a landscaper, but he also sort of worked as a maintenance supervisor for the VA hospital. And landscaping was going to be the thing that I did. I ended up getting there, got 2 years into University of Georgia, and ended up changing my major to physical education. And I think I got to a point where I started looking at neighborhoods and resources in a completely different manner, particularly because of the fact that we were dealing with situations where students just didn't have access to the resources that they needed to be able to play effectively. And as we'll talk a little bit about later, that impacts health disparities. So Finished at University of Georgia in 1999, ended up getting a degree in sport management at Georgia State University, and actually ended up being recruited back from one of my professors to work on my doctorate in physical education and curriculum, particularly in curriculum and instruction. And my dissertation, and I know you have some chops that's sort of related to that. So I ended up doing my dissertation in Atlanta, Georgia, and I specifically wanted to study school structure.
Okay.
And structures between elementary schools and how people in those schools taught students. Because as we all know, the foundations for movement start at a young age.
That's right.
And I wanted to specifically look at what were the differences between schools that had white teachers and schools that had Black teachers, and how they taught their particular, as we called it then, multiculturalism. We call it something a little bit different now, but how they taught their students.
Okay.
And one thing I realized when I was collecting data in the Atlanta area is that you could literally drive 10 minutes in either direction and see a completely different set of resources in each school. And this made me think about the kind of neighborhoods that I grew up in, where you literally had the same thing. You could drive to certain parts of Decatur and see people with massive amounts of like room and equipment. And then you drive to certain parts of the cab in Atlanta where you see what dirt feels. Okay. So I got into this research, really moving to Indiana. I moved to Indiana in 2006 and really started doing a lot of community-based participatory research. In Indiana, we started seeing some of the same trends as it relates to Atlanta, Georgia, in terms of places for people to work out. So if you can think about like a big circle, every spot that was a Black population, you had the resources and facilities for people to be physically active that were 10 miles away from the inner city, what they would call the inner city, right? So that's when I really started looking at space in more an intentional fashion. I took a few trips to Africa to kind of expand sort of my worldview on that. And then I ended up doing a Fulbright in 2014, 2015. Then this job here at KSU came back and I decided to get back
in it. You mentioned the word space.
Yes.
And that's where I want to land this conversation today, because as I said in the introduction, one of your research interests is spatial injustice or spatial justice. And you did some research, and I'll name it Black Perspectives in Spatial Justice. You did research in that particular area, and that's the title of it. So here's the question that I want to know, because the term of spatial justice is new for me. I'm sure it's new for some of my listening audience, and we want to know more. We want to learn today. So what is spatiality, and how does spatiality relate to civil rights and justice?
All right. So spatiality, it's the simplest way we can talk about spatiality is thinking about the effects of space on actions, on interactions, and also entities. So you have to think about it in terms of space and people are connected.
Right.
So when we think about like where we came from and how we were brought over to the United States and landing here in 16 and 19, and the narrative that was pretty much placed on, and I'm talking specifically about Black groups like African-American slavery, from slavery into the United States. So we recognize just in that trip over the Middle Passage, for instance, that space has been a very important piece. And we may be able to talk about water and how that fits in all of this a little bit later, because that's a really big part of it. So you think about one geographical space where you have a group of people, and then another group of people is influencing the movement of that marginalized group of people that they've taken and put into a place that they don't even have residency in, because obviously we know we have indigenous groups that were here before the first colonizers or settlers, or however people want to sort of mention. So that's the first thing to sort of understand, is that this idea that space and society are connected things and that they have a lot of different levels. So when we think about people being connected to this space and society over a period of time, if people stay in a certain place, places get identified with them.
Okay.
For instance, when we look at where I'm at in Atlanta, depending on who you talk to, is considered a Black Mecca.
Right.
And a place for civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
And people ask, if they come from outside of the country, well, why is that the case? Well, when you look at the history of Black leadership here in Atlanta, the history of the civil rights movement, and even when you compare it to towns such as Atlanta and Birmingham,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened when you had leadership in the 1960s and 70s, Black leadership, who sort of pushed Atlanta in a different direction, and sort of what happened in Birmingham in terms of Black leaders not really being allowed to like kind of ascend a
Mm-hmm.
bit. You look at how space sort of impacts those particular pieces. One other piece when we talk about spatiality, I think is very important. We also talk about the image of who is perceived to be in a certain space.
Okay.
So we talked a little bit earlier, but at least you introed about Mr. Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Floyd's situation where he literally had police officers that thought he was in the wrong place and that he didn't need to be there. Right.
Right.
And we think about what that means for certain groups of people, right? For Black people in this country in particular, we're never seen as people who are supposed to belong in any space.
Wow.
So we have been looked at, even though we've contributed a lot to building the country,
Mm-hmm.
we're still looked at as people who are infringers on space.
You know, when you were talking and you said how sometimes people determine, that Black people don't belong in a particular space, the question that you always get asked is, what are you doing here?
Right.
Or why you're in this neighborhood?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? As though other people have rights to space.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and,
yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then they determine whether or not you are somewhere legally.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
And to kind of add a little bit to that, I mean, when we talk about space, we also have to recognize, because I do a lot of work in the kinesiology field. So
okay.
I'm a trained physical educator, but now, as I've moved on here, I'm now a movement specialist. Okay. And we have to understand that these ideas about space, if you're a person from a historically marginalized community, goes back literally to these ideas about hierarchies, right?
Okay, yeah.
And when we talk about whiteness and
mm-hmm.
this idea of white at the top of that particular pyramid and every other group kind of falling underneath behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, we recognize that white males are at the top of that pyramid.
Right.
And after that, then it's God, whatever religion and concept that people generally have, and then everybody else is seen as different. When you go back and even look at how older European groups perceived people of color,
mm-hmm.
we were attributed to animals.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So this idea of animalistic qualities being put on African Americans and Black populations turns into a situation where it's like, well, you're not human enough to be in a space, so therefore we get to tell you what to do in that space. And I think that's a very important thing when you look at what's going on right now with the whole George Floyd situation.
Mm-hmm.
Having your knee in someone's back for 9 minutes,
mm-hmm.
irrespective of what you think about that situation, that's the same way that you would treat an animal. In fact, I would even suggest that animals get treated better than Mr. Floyd was treating that situation.
Let me just also add that I in the introduction, or at least I was speaking earlier, I talked about the George Floyd, but I also talked about the situation that you're having down there in Florida with the voter registration and voter suppression. It's interesting that when the argument or supposed argument came up about illegal votes, it's interesting the states and the cities that they targeted where they said all the illegal activity took place. Wisconsin, whatever the city is in Wisconsin, or Detroit, or Philadelphia, or the Atlanta area where Black people are located, they were the ones that were identified as where the illegal voting took place. So kind of hit on that a little bit, because I would assume also that's that same injustice, about space, about identify certain areas, because they didn't target other areas, even where the loser of the election, where he didn't get votes. But the only areas that he targeted were what? Were Black areas.
Correct. So there are people who can, first of all, let me preface this, that will talk a lot better about this situation than I can, because they have more of an understanding of things such as gentrification and redlining. But essentially, a lot of these things go back to historical policies of where we think Black people should be. Okay.
Right.
In the South in particular, Jim Crow. Right. So we recognize that Jim Crow has been a big part of this whole thing. And also white flight has been a big part of this, which historically, we've had white people in cities.
Right.
And when you look at like how things have been redlined and then voting gerrymandering, where we've had white groups in many large cities in the South that decided they wanted to go back outside of the city because the fear of a Black face, for lack of a better word.
Right.
So what happened is Black people moving obviously into these areas, into the city. And now it is sort of flipped to where the reverse is happening, and it's happening through gentrification by, jacking up the prices so much that people can't even be on their own real estate and pay, and then they're ended up forcing to sell. Now, in terms of voting, recognizing that this has been a pattern for a long period of time, particularly in southern cities. And I don't want to say that it doesn't happen everywhere, because it does, but particularly in southern cities. I think, yes, if you were a person who wanted to specifically target a certain group's votes and try to steal an election, for lack of a better word, you would target those Black groups, right? And some of the legislation that's obviously happening right now, and some of the things in terms of the cancellation, are things that I think most of the people in this audience are paying attention to as well. You think about it in terms of trying to cancel the vote, but also trying to cancel opportunities for people to go vote.
Right.
To just, for instance, trying to ban water from being served in line. I mean, water is a natural right for all human beings, right?
Absolutely.
And you would think that would be something that you wouldn't stop people from drinking water to eating pizza. But I think even more egregiously, as we talk about one piece of this law that really is, to me, the most targeted aspect of Black people, is Sunday voting.
Yes. So to the polls.
It's to the polls.
Yeah.
And we recognize that in our history as African Americans, the church is a central piece of how we have gotten voice.
That's right. Yeah.
So to specifically target Sunday voting is saying, I'm targeting Black people. And
Absolutely.
There's no way around it. So they knew what they were doing. And I got to be careful because I don't want to get into trouble with some of these things, but the targets, that people knew exactly what they're doing when they were targeting that situation. And now we sort of see some of the same thing with space in a different way when we think about the Major League Baseball All-Star game just recently got canceled.
Yes.
And that is a dynamic by itself, because anyone who's here in Atlanta will tell you, when you look at the Braves, they would even have a conversation that goes back a few decades to even before the Olympic Games came. If you recognize how many times the Atlanta Braves stadium has changed.
Right.
In the past 30 years, from Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, where, by the way, you had large amounts of Black people who were vendors, who were selling things down there at the stadium, then to Olympic Stadium, then to moving out here to Marietta, where I'm at right now, which is not technically Atlanta, no matter what people say.
Okay.
To those type of things. So those are some pieces that are sort of involved in that as well, when we talk about space and movement and power.
When you hit on voter registration, you took it back to the civil rights times and civil rights legislation. President Biden the other day said that the current laws that were now established in Georgia are almost like Jim Crow 2.0. I don't know if you heard what he referenced it to. Do you think that was too strong of a language, considering what Jim Crow was, or was it not strong enough?
That's a great question. I've actually, my parents this weekend, I saw them for Easter. We sat down and talked about this.
Okay.
And, I think their thought was that's as strong as he could say without getting into some other stuff.
Sure.
I think most of us, I will always tell you that it's not strong enough.
Okay.
Right? I don't think it's strong enough. And the reason why, but part of us, we have to understand the fact that we have a great amount of our population in the United States that are just not taught about Jim Crow in schools.
Right.
They're not. So it has to be a 2.0 because sometimes people don't even recognize what the old Jim Crow was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about Jim Crow as a relic of the past.
Right.
But some of the things that are happening right now, again, a la gentrification, voter suppression, these little laws that folks kind of say, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? They're targeted towards certain groups.
Right.
And
right.
it is Jim Crow 2.0. Yeah, I think that's the strongest that he could have the language. I mean, particularly given the past 2 years. And as you know, you've talked about it before. We live in a very fractured society.
Sure.
And we're coming hopefully out of the pandemic. We're dealing with some stuff related to the economy. We have social media that I talk about from time to time with my students. We didn't have what everyone else has now. And I'm 44 years old.
Okay.
So my students that are 18, 19, and 20, the way they get their information is through social media, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Twitter. And it doesn't really leave a lot of time for long discussions.
Right.
What it does is get people inflamed. So we have people who can't really connect on any real level and have a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have people who are playing by two different sets of facts.
Right.
So we have like reality versus propaganda.
Sure. In your research, you said that there were 3 perspectives: past, present, and future. Would you kind of talk about those and explain what you mean by that in terms of spatiality, right?
That's great. Great question. So I usually use past, present, and future. And what I like to do in my work, I like to highlight Black perspectives, particularly people who we've probably forgotten about. So the past perspective, and I know you probably recognize this name here. You've already seen it, Gordon Parks.
Yes.
Right? So Gordon Parks is known in our community for a lot of different things. In fact, I think even as well known as he is, he's ridiculously underrated as a person I think we should be talking about more.
Okay.
Gordon Parks did a lot of things, such as taking pictures of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement. And think about this, we live in a social media world right now where we take for granted the fact that we can have a picture of George Floyd situation or police acting bad or whatever situation.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, going into segregated areas, particularly in the southern United States in the late 40s and late 50s, to take pictures and actually show folks that Jim Crow legislation is actively working against Black people.
Okay.
Because it's one thing to say that we have separated spaces, but he actually took pictures of people in segregated spaces and had a couple of run-ins, if you ever read any of his autobiography and book. But he had some personal run-ins with that from people who just didn't want him reporting that information out.
Mm-hmm.
So we think about war correspondents a lot of times, right? And we generally think of war correspondents in terms of, okay, they're leaving the United States and going to a foreign country and they're putting their lives in jeopardy. Or Gordon Parks was putting his life in jeopardy because he was taking the visual means of looking at African-American space and doing 2 things. First of all, not just showing the bad parts.
Right.
Because historically, our narrative that's framed through a lot of white ran media or even white perceptions of media is that we have a deficit.
Right.
Like our whole lives are spent talking about deficit and not joy. So Parks is important historically because he was able to show Black people navigating through a very ridiculous segregated time, but also the joy of being a Black person in a segregated society. So that would be the historic person I typically focus on a lot in the lectures.
Mm.
The present, and a lot of people now are talking about James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because James Baldwin has not been with us for a long time.
Right.
But I think with Baldwin, we have a lot of people who are reinvesting in looking at his work. And specifically, one of the things that he talked about, and I think this was in Ebony or Jet magazine, I think by 1963, 64, don't quote me on that. But one of the things that he wrote about when just this thing is like, who established this distance?
Yes, yes, yes.
This, right. And right, who established this? Like, who created this?
Mm-hmm.
Because we just assume people are here.
Right.
But it goes back to the historical pieces of it. And again, recognize the fact this is the United States government.
Mm-hmm.
And if you talk to some of our indigenous brothers and sisters, they will tell you the exact same thing. The amount of treaties that the United States of America has broken is something that we don't even talk about in history, but this is a well-known fact, right?
Right.
So we look at like the government established this distance, right? And the people who are running that government. We think about what happened after the Civil War for Black people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we had an opportunity after emancipation to pretty much go into our own areas, our own arenas, our own cities, our own markets. And we had people in this country that wasn't good enough for.
Right.
So that was the creation of the Black codes, as we know, and then the Jim Crow movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So understanding the fact that we have those elements in place that have established this distance. We didn't do it.
Right.
But we always have to remind people.
That's right.
Anytime we talk about civil rights legislation, we have to recognize the fact that the reason we wanted civil rights is because there was no civil rights. And people often get testy about that and they take it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also the second thing Baldwin would talk about was what is this distance designed to protect, to the point that I think he got so frustrated in his career that he went off to France.
Yes.
And I mean, and to think about how angry do you have to be with the country that you're living in order to say, you know what, these people are not respecting me as a person, number one, as a man, number two, as a person who's telling folks, number three, what should be happening in terms of content. Sorry about that. That's an automatic light. But to leave.
Yes.
And then the last person is one of my favorite people to talk about, who I think we'll be having much more discussions about her as we sort of move on, and it's Octavia Butler.
Okay.
And Octavia Butler, the reason why I think a lot of people have not caught on to Octavia Butler historically, because she's science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot of people, but we do have people who don't necessarily appreciate that medium as much as they should, particularly when it's written by Black people. We're seeing a lot more science fiction and Afrofuturism and talking about the future of Black people now. But interestingly enough, Octavia Butler, what she discussed in a lot of her work was breaking these ideas and these hierarchies.
Okay.
Because space creates hierarchies, and not letting other people define who we are as people, but what are we going to be as we sort of navigate these futures? And I'll give you one quick example about this. And I like watching a lot of science fiction, but one of the things that I would recognize when I was growing up was just, quite frankly, the fact that, man, there wasn't a whole lot of Black people in the future. I mean, when you look at Star Trek and Star Wars, and I mean, that's kind of stuff, and you sort of looking, and even in the Black representation, it was a lot of stereotypical pieces to it.
That's right.
So Billy D. Williams, much as we love him, he was played as a stereotypical hustler.
Right.
When we look at Geordi LaForge, I think with Star Trek Next Generation, he was looked at as somebody who they didn't really talk to a whole lot, was very brilliant, but we just didn't have, and that's just men.
Mm-hmm.
We're not even talking about the representation of women in that particular context as well. So yeah, those are the three, in terms of three people I've talked about more recently in the work. And like, because I think with a general audience, I think that we gravitate a little bit to those more. I think historically we've talked just about civil rights leaders, and I think that's a great thing, but we also have to recognize the fact that there's other avenues that are not just programmed. Like when we talk about Malcolm and Martin, for instance, there's a lot of discussion that is driven not by us.
Right.
I mean, as you know, the amount of times they've taken Dr. King out of context, that they don't really read his work. They take a few quotes and spread it around. And what they did to that man was absolutely unbelievable. So,
yeah. Let me ask you this, because you spoke a lot about, spatiality, uh, and racial and social injustice. Uh, What does that mean for Black people in 2020 and beyond?
it's a great question. So, I think one of the biggest things that spatiality means for us as we move on here is recognizing, first of all, the worth of our bodies, number one, because I talk about this all the time. When we look at our bodies and how people portray our bodies, we are looked at as labor still in 2021.
Wow.
And we don't want to think about that, but the United States of America was built on slave and immigrant labor.
That's
I mean,
right.
that's just the truth of the matter. And we don't think about that usually because most of us are too busy, like on the grind, like we're trying, let's make the money, let's make the money, let's make the money. It's curious, and this is what we should be thinking about as well, how our athletes, as great as they are still in a system where they really don't have a whole lot of power.
That's
right?
correct.
Like, so we're it's like we're lauded for our athletic talents and our entertaining talents, but our intellectual talents, not so much.
Right.
Like, and it's a fascinating thing. And the reason why I said it is because look at curriculum in books and what we learn in schools. You would think that where we are right now in 2021, we should have more of a comprehensive discussion of the history of the United States.
Yes.
We don't.
Right.
It is very, very steeped in whiteness. And it's still, for us, I think we have to get to a point to where we advocate, and we have allies as well, and work with our allies to help get more representation in curriculum, number one, first, and then more representation in things that don't necessarily involve entertainment. Yes. And again, I want to make sure we're clear on this. That doesn't mean that anything's wrong with that, but it's the only thing that the United States, and I would even say outside of the globe, they know us for. It's like the people who lead the most in this society tend to be entertainers.
Absolutely.
They're not, like, my dad was a middle-class guy that was from the country, right? He's from Edenton, Georgia, came up to Atlanta with nothing. He was the guy that was in charge of neighborhood watch, but cutting grass like outside of the neighborhood growing up. Like, and people used to be like, why are you doing that? It's like, we got to keep our neighborhoods together, right? We don't have a lot of men like that are what I would say they exist, right? But we're not really talking about it. And I think that's a problem, and it should infuriate people. So I think that's one piece in terms of spatiality. I think as well, and this is just something that's going to continue to happen. We have to bring our issues to the table in a more substantive fashion when we're making decisions, voting decisions. Like, a lot of the stuff that's happening right here in Atlanta is just the fact that we need leadership to continue to vote these people out. Right. They just don't, they have, it's one thing if people had ideas. These people don't have any ideas. They just want to literally keep people back in 1960.
And, they believe that the only way to win is to suppress the vote.
Right.
Because like you said it, because they do not have the ideas that are needed for this current culture and society. And because they don't have them, we'll come up with these illegal, unethical strategies in order to win elections.
And it's also a fear. It's
Absolutely.
Just flat out fear that people who look like, and inevitably that is going to happen. If you look at any population statistic monitor, because they've said, well, it'll be 2030, well, it'll be 2050. We have some people here who are just afraid of folks that they've never sat down and really talked to.
Right.
And you're always going to have that percentage of people. Like, I really believe that, which is why I think you have to work a little bit better with younger people to have the comprehensive education at the beginning, because a lot of our younger people have been seduced to thinking that, racism doesn't exist, classism doesn't exist, and actually does. The problem is that these things is hidden. It's so hidden in terms of how they interact with people. Like they can be very diverse and say, well, I listen to everybody on radio, I listen to everybody on TV. But when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and when it comes to finding jobs, and we think about health disparities, it's still impacting people in really significant ways.
Dr. Culp, as I bring this wonderful conversation to a close, I really have enjoyed having this conversation with you. I want to ask you this before I go. You talked about, again, spatiality and social justice or injustice. If you had your way, what change would you make about, the way things are in terms of that particular subject? What do you think that you would just say, this is what I would do to make a change?
That's a great question. Wow, there's been so much to talk about this. And again, at some point you'll probably talk to somebody about reparations if you haven't already.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you flat out, it's changed for me in 20 years because I grew up in a situation where I was like, yeah, I don't know if that's the best thing. And the reason why, because my thought process was at the time you would find people who would not necessarily identify with Black groups.
Right.
Would say, hey, I need reparations, right?
Okay, yeah.
That was the fear. As I've gotten older and I've done more research and I've looked at if you just look at health disparities by themselves, I don't know how they're going to take care of it. I don't know, but man, when we look at the totality of what's happened to just Black people in the United States, financially, we're behind. From a health disparities perspective, we're behind. And that doesn't take away from the fact that, hey, people are out here working because they're out here working and they're still not catching up. Like wealth is still behind. So I think if I had to wave a magic wand today and say, what is the biggest change? I think it's teaching people what to do with finances if they get some type of reparations with.
Gotcha.
I think that there are certain communities as well that probably should be historically zoned, that specifically talk about the history that was there before. And the reason why I mention that is because with gentrification, what's happening in a lot of these situations is that they're stripping out the old community, the old buildings, with literally no discussion of who was there before. And that's a very important thing, because if I'm coming to a city for the first time, I want to know if I'm a young Black child in America,
right?
And I want to know my history. If I don't see my history, then I'm thinking to myself, I hadn't done anything.
Right.
So those are probably the two biggest things. And if I could change them tomorrow, because you got to know where you've been in order to know where you're going to go. Yes. And I think that's a real bad thing that we've historically done in this country. We don't tell people, and that's not. And we don't need that. We don't need to not like other groups.
Right.
And I think people get that confused. It's like, well, this is about taking away. No, it doesn't take away from me. We just need to highlight what's been done previously, so that we have that template and that historical piece for people in the future.
I had a guest on recently, and I asked her to dispel or debunk a myth about Black people. And I said, well, what myth is there about Black people that you want to debunk? And she says that Black people have no history.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And that's exactly what you were saying, how we tell the story, how it's been sanitized and whitewashed, and it doesn't include us other than slavery. I mean, that's all they tell, but they don't tell all the other great exploits that our people have had. So, so we do have a history. I'm going to debunk that myth right now. We have a history and we are a great people.
Yep.
But Dr. Culp, I just want to take the time to thank you for being on the show. Before I close, give us some of your social media contact information.
Well, you can find me at Culture in Motion on Twitter. I go through periods where I don't use Twitter as much, just because Twitter, you can get on some shenanigans with Twitter.
Right.
But I think if you put in a search for Brian Culp, you will probably find everything that I've ever written. This is a good and bad thing. You'll be able to find my contact information for my university. And yeah, if you have any questions, I would tell people, feel free to reach out. I mean, we're all busy at this time of the year with various things, but yeah, that's how you can probably find me the fastest, is just to put in a search and go from there.
Well, Dr. Culp, I thank you for coming on the show today. You have been truly an inspiration. You've enlightened us. You've encouraged us. You've informed us. And I really, really appreciate it. Appreciate you. And as I say to all of my guests that come on the show, you have gone beyond the culture. And I thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invite, Dr. Walker. And we're looking forward to seeing some more episodes. These things are great.
Absolutely. So you take care.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Now, if you want to continue to hear inspiring interviews like the one you heard today, I want you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. Also, rate the show and please leave a comment. I would also love it if you would share this podcast with your friends to let them know that we're on. Finally, please go to our website at www.beyondtheculturepodcast.com, or you can email me at beyondtheculturepodcast@gmail.com. On the website, you can subscribe to the show and connect with me by leaving your email address. I'd love to hear from you. This is your host, Dr. David Walker, and we'll talk again on Beyond the Culture. Take care.